All right, this is session 3. Welcome. I will light our chalice. I have a chalice here. And I'm going to remind us of the word from the UUA Board of Trustees from last time, and the Article 2 Commission. They are calling on us to be committed to personal, institutional, and cultural change rooted in anti-oppression, anti-racism, and multiculturalism values and practices. Love in action should guide us in the transformation of ourselves, our communities, and our faith into active networks of collective care, restoration, and justice. Love in action should challenge Unitarian Universalists to place liberation in all its dimensions at the center of our lives. So in that spirit, we will get started. So just very briefly, last week, we talked about Martin Luther King and empirical process theology and how those two theological trajectories can help ground our racial justice work. This session will focus on African-American naturalistic humanism and feminist liberation theology. And we will have some time for some questions in between those two trajectories, and then some final thoughts and wrap up. So, while resting on different theological foundations from those of Martin Luther King, I contend that African-American naturalistic humanism is also capable of grounding the inherent worth and dignity of all people and the racial justice to which our faith calls us. So African-American naturalistic humanism, I didn't have this labeled. This person is Anthony Pinn, and I'm drawing on a lot of his work. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what he says. He points out that African-American religion cannot be reduced just to Christianity or theism. African-Americans participate in lots of traditions, such as Yoruba, Santeria, Islam, and humanism. In the context of Unitarian Universalist, African-Americans bring their lived experiences of what it means to be Black in our nation, with a deep recognition of suffering and struggle as fundamental to the reality of Black bodies in America. And I think it's incumbent on UU theology to not only recognize the disproportionate suffering of African Americans, but to also prophetically and pastorally contend with the fundamental existence of moral evil. So I'm going to talk about the two aspects of what I'm calling African-American naturalistic humanism. So this is the humanism part. And then in the next couple slides, I'll break down what naturalistic means. So some basic tenets of humanism is that humanity is fully and solely accountable and responsible for the human condition and the correction of humanity's plight. And we recognize that we are a part of an interdependent web of existence. Humanists are typically suspicious of or even reject supernatural explanations and claims. So many humanists, most humanists, disbelieve in God and gods. Anthony Pinn talks about how we can center community rather than God as our centering category. And this centering of community helps us not just focus on our individual selves. And he also says that our ordinary experiences can be source material for our theologizing. Community can help us also confront the notion of the human as the measure of all things, and it fills out the nature and meaning of life. And community rather than God can be a litmus test of moral belonging. So now I'm going to tell you what the naturalistic part of African-American naturalistic humanism. So at the heart of naturalism is just the simple claim that Any truths we're ever going to discover and any meaning in life that we should uncover are revealed to us through the natural order. And William Hart helps us understand why putting humanism in a broader context of naturalism is helpful. He says, naturalism is what humanism looks like when it accents the evolutionary kinship of all life forms, embraces the claim that nature, probably, is all there is, and values the forms of ecstatic fulfillment that nature provides. Naturalists are more attuned to the problem of anthropocentrism than are humanists, because humanists are sometimes accused of smuggling God in through the back door by deifying humans. So that's why I'm putting these two things together. I'm trying to situate humans in the larger natural world. That helps us feel a part of humanity and other beings and other parts in the natural world, not just ourselves. So Carol Wayne White, who was on the slide earlier, talks about Black lives as sacred humanity. And I think this is a way of naturalizing King's notion of somebodyness, which we talked about last week. There's a synergy between White and King in her concept of sacred humanity. White brings humanism and naturalism together to declare humanity, specifically Black humanity, as sacred, despite persistent and dehumanizing anti-Black racism. And she encourages Unitarian Universalists to contest impoverished models of Black animality and other distorted racial constructs. Embracing White's perspective calls on UUs to continue to reject ideologies that bifurcate our humanity and instill a sense of inferiority and unworthiness in some, and a false sense of superiority in others. She says that religiously this implies love, and love implies concern for the well-being of all. The concept of sacred humanity then reinforces perspectives from all of the wisdom traditions that adamantly promote kindness, empathy, and compassion for all natural processes, including human ones. Humans have a responsibility to act in ways that promote the flourishing of all life and to urge other humans who may be less inclined toward our interconnectedness to do the same. So I'm kind of, this slide is talking about how this idea of declaring Black lives as sacred, what is an ethical fruit of this theology? So I think by declaring Black lives are sacred, we can apply this concept and support Black lives of Unitarian Universalism. Blue is an organization within Unitarian Universalism that is a thriving spiritual community and an adjusted-minded organization. Blue is committed to building a Unitarian Universalism that is liberatory and life-giving for Black people. We manifest this dream by creating spiritual community, resources, and political education opportunities for Black UUs and other Black folks who share our values. So I think if we're white, we can financially support Blue, and we can also participate in some of the justice work that Blue is doing in the world. Here in the Twin Cities, Blue is working on some affordable housing projects. So that's one way that we can work with Blue. And if we're Black, we can join Blue if that helps, if that's something that we might be interested in as a way of finding community within Unitarian Universalism. So that's one, what I'm calling ethical fruit of African-American naturalistic humanism. So here's another one. A second ethical fruit of African-American naturalistic humanism is finding hope in struggle. And this comes from Anthony Pinn. So instead of feeling hopeless, despondent, or nihilistic in the face of ongoing oppression, Anthony Pinn contends that the meaning of our lives can be found in human struggle. So in contrast to finding hope or eventual justice in a promised afterlife, as in Christianity, it's our human responsibility to ameliorate suffering and evil in this life. And one way of doing that is finding hope in the struggle itself. So Pin's response to ongoing suffering in the world for me, and I think many you use, is particularly compelling for its ability to confront absurdity head on with honesty, audacity, spiritual maturity, and hope. And how he does this is he draws on the myth of Sisyphus. And to remind you all, if you don't remember the myth of Sisyphus, it's where Zeus punishes Sisyphus for refusing to stay in the land of the dead by making him push a giant rock up the hill, only to have it fall back down. And he does this over and over. He has to push that rock up the hill. So Pin uses this myth to explore the appropriate response to the absurdity of ongoing oppression, racism, and anti-Blackness. And he asks, is it suicide? Is the killing of oneself in light of the human condition, the existential angst and ontological trauma we face, a proper resolution to our dilemma? Using Albert Camus, he says, without God, they push for something more. They see in struggle against nihilism and injustice the stuff of worthy existence, the purpose of life without certainties. And he has the audacity to say the punishment does not seem to crush him. The rock doesn't seem to crush Sisyphus. And he even challenges us to imagine Sisyphus happy pushing this rock up the hill. So I kind of think one example I think of with this is if we think back to Barack Obama was elected as our first Black president. The rock got up the hill, but then 8 years later, Trump was elected and the rock came back down. But it doesn't help to just feel despair. I think many of us fought against Trump and we pushed the rock back up the hill because that's what we have. We have just our sheer human will to be in the struggle. But Pin also points out that pushing the rock up the hill doesn't need to be a lonely and individualistic enterprise. We can do the hard work of justice together in community while holding ourselves accountable to that community. So in the struggle, we can find a new type of hope, one that is applicable to humanists working to turn punishment into possibility, angst into awareness, and repetition into resistance. We remain committed to work for justice by celebrating the sheer strength of human will, solidarity with our neighbor, and the integrity of our goals, despite knowing that these may not be enough to win the day. Renewing our justice efforts, knowing that struggle is what we have to offer. Struggle is its own reward, and it can be a way to achieve the spiritual wholeness promised in the 8th principle, in my opinion. So in conclusion, by interrogating human experience and human history, Anthony Pin, Carol Wayne White, and Bill Hart find no rational basis for theism, and instead mark out life meaning based solely on human accountability, responsibility, and potential. African-American naturalistic humanism urges ethics and moral codes that value the web of life, of which humanity is a small part, and assumes we work to improve the arrangements of collective and individual life without any sort of divine assistance. Even in the face of certain physical death, our common human destiny, African-American naturalistic humanist ethics invites Unitarian Universalists to act without appeal, to bring about meaning in a world marked by the absurdity of anti-Blackness and racial oppression. Humanist ethics invite UUs to love life in the consciousness of impotence, to affirm transitory joys amidst persistent, all too persistent sorrows, and pursue justice in a world where many injustices are never acknowledged, much less remediated, and most victims die anonymously. So I think personally for me, I find Pin's idea of finding hope in the struggle somewhat liberating. It helps me not focus so much on the end result or this final, like we're going to get there. I mean, we are going to get there, but the rock might fall back down. The purpose is just to keep working in the struggle and keep working in the struggle. and celebrate the joys when we find them, the successes when we find them, and to try to not lose hope when the rock falls down. So that's what I have on African-American naturalistic humanism. I'm gonna maybe stop sharing for a second. And if people want to chime in here, I would love to know where you are finding hope and joy in the work for justice. Does anyone want to talk about joy? Otherwise, I can move on.
Hi, this is Mike.
Oh, hi, Mike.
Try to find a video here. There we are. I'm sort of off to the side here, so sorry about the sideways view.
That's okay.
I guess I am. I think of a couple things. I'm sort of thinking out loud here. What I'm hearing is the idea of, it would be tempting to say it's not the destination, it's the journey, but it really is the destination and the journey. So, what the message I'm hearing is sort of, this is a lot of work. We got to do the work, take joy in the work, enjoy, and not so much enjoy the journey as, get fulfillment from the journey. And with the idea that, there will be steps forward and steps back, that if we look at history as any measure of what's required, it is going to take a very long time, because the forces pushing back are strong, and they're intent on, pushing back like crazy. So that's the sense I have of it.
I just got a text asking me for the link. So let me just send this to someone. So if you'll just bear with me here. Go. Let's put it right here. There we go. Anyone else finding any hope in the struggle?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I love is that, for Penn, it's simply that we can struggle.
Right.
There's no attention to a guaranteed success that we will in fact win the day. We don't actually look at outcomes. We just look at the struggle itself as grounding our joy. Also, it's important. One thing to keep in mind is when he says, imagine Sisyphus happy, he's not talking about some sentimental view of happiness. He's talking about existential fulfillment, where we find a basic contentment in life, even though life is devoid of certitude, life is devoid of assurance, and life is in fact a perpetual struggle. So I find that utterly empowering. Hopeful, I don't know if that's the right word, but certainly empowering. Joy as in the sense of existential contentment.
Thank you. Sorry, Peter, I didn't catch you a little bit earlier, but welcome. We just oh boy. We're getting a little feedback from oops, I just muted you now. Anyway, I think, yeah, we can move on to the next trajectory, and then we can have some final thoughts here. I will go back to sharing my screen. And we'll move on to Sharon Welch. So the final theological trajectory that I talk about in my dissertation and that we're going to discuss tonight is the feminist liberation theology of Sharon Welsh. And she is one of our maybe sole living actual Unitarian Universalist theologians. She started her career as a Christian, but found Unitarian Universalism pretty early on, I think, and has been a UU for over 25 years, 30 years. And she has, her thought is really, is very similar in a lot of ways to Anthony Pinn. Her questions are, how do we work for justice in the face of evil and despair, kind of like Pinn? And how she talks about how we can use our power responsively and collaboratively to work for a genuinely inclusive democracy and resist the rise of authoritarianism and explicit racism. In agreement with Sharon Welsh, Anthony Pinn highlights the fact that there is no foundation for moral action that guarantees individuals and groups will act in productive and liberating ways, or that they will ultimately achieve their objectives. Therefore, ethical activity is risky or dangerous because it requires operating without the certainty and security of a clearly articulated product. Welsh's approach, like Pinn, offers a sober, realistic, and historically borne out sense of what can be achieved, based on the nature and meaning of embodied selves. It understands that human relationships with self, others, and the world are messy, inconsistent, and thick with desires, contradictions, motives, and a hopeful hopelessness. It is to this question of finding liberation in the face of these contradictions, evil and despair, that Sharon Welsh theology addresses. I think Sharon Welsh's theology may help us to awaken to the threats of white nationalists without succumbing to despair. Absolutely, we are all shattered by the reality that it can be this bad again. Lynchings, hate crimes, and other forms of white violence against people of color. White activists who are committed to racial justice have not done enough to stop the rise of explicit racism and hatred. We can and must do more, she says. I think Sharon Welsh's theology may be able to help you frame a theological vision towards this more. She seeks to offer an ethical theology that can liberate us amid a world of indifference. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about her theological and ethical framework. Sharon Welsh says that the truth of theological claims are measured not by their correspondence to something eternal, but by the fulfillment of its claims in history, the actual creation of communities of peace, justice, and equality. So for Welsh, the referent of the phrase liberating God is not God, but liberation. So where there is liberation, that is divine. Welsh boldly seeks to include the perspectives of multiple communities with divergent principles, norms, and mores because homogeneous community, she says, lacks credible authority to expose injustices like slavery, oppression of women, etc. And she also makes an a priori moral commitment to the oppressed. Solidarity takes the place of traditional notions of redemption for Welsh. She also focuses on our fallibility. We can act out of love and accountability, but we might have ideological blinders. Our vision is always perspectival. Interest and power need to be checked, she says. While she grounds her work in an a priori commitment to the oppressed, she understands this choice to be a moral one, a choice not free from the concomitant element of risk. In liberation theology, she says, one chooses to think and act from the perspective of the oppressed. To be a feminist theology of liberation, she says, is to recognize the constitutive role of one's matrix, participation in resistance struggles, and to choose to continue and think and act from this perspective, recognizing the contingency of that choice and the possibility of that perspective being superseded. I really love this about her work. She realizes that our ideas could change. They could be superseded, that we're, we have ideological blinders. But she says we need to embrace the risk of and resist cynicism and despair. I'm just looking at my notes here. Yeah, and again, she talks about how we can use our power responsibly. So that's a little bit about her theological and ethical framework. I like this part too. She talks about this theology as the life and death struggle, both practical and conceptual, between nihilism and commitment, between despair and hope. And she talks about how the oppressed don't have the luxury of hopelessness. So that's another reason why we need to keep fighting, staying in the fight for justice. She talks about the dangerous memory of human suffering. When she looks back at all of the historical suffering, it becomes more difficult to imagine a compensation for that suffering, even if it's eradicated in the future. To honestly live and believe as universal the imperative of love and freedom is to hope that suffering can be ended, to hope that all lives without liberation in history were not meaningless. But it is to work for this hope without the guarantee that such meaning is possible. This is pretty radical, I think. She claims that the divine is in that relational power and that it is neither necessary nor liberating to posit a substance or ground that exists outside relational power. So again, she's pretty humanistic in her thought. She doesn't think that there's a God that is the ground of this. She says the power of compassion is divine. The compassion expressed in simple acts of acknowledging each other's fear and pain, standing with a baby with colic, caring for a friend dying of AIDS, acknowledging without diminishment the pain that others feel. The power of saying your pain is real, your cries are heard, and your anger is just. The power of compassion and anger, she says, is holy. So claiming the power of compassion as divine can both ground and inspire our work as you use for racial justice. Acknowledging this work as holy gives us hope in the face of failure and despair. And she grounds solidarity in love and hope, not guilt and shame, which is another reason I love her work. She talks about this work as spiritual labor. And she says it's so much more powerful when we are moved to moral action by love and hope, not guilt or duty. We need to continually learn, and that's not a sign of weakness or depravity. It's born of complexity and dynamism. We're always learning more about history, about our participation in white supremacy, and that's okay, that's good. All right. I'm just looking over my notes here. She says the healing response of whites to racism, of men to sexism, is quite simple: repentance. Out of love for others, out of love for oneself as a person who respects all people, it is possible to admit fault, to examine social patterns that perpetuate racism and sexism, and to begin the careful work of making amends, of building egalitarian social structures. This latter process need not be torturous or life-denying, but can be life-giving. She says it can lead all of us to find a larger self and a deeper joy in the challenge of mending the rifts of injustice. Although it is understandably difficult to acknowledge complicity in structures of oppression, this difficulty is mitigated when our acknowledgement is grounded in strength, in the eager search for a self made larger through the challenge of accountability. Change also occurs when the response to this knowledge is not guilt, but repentance, a deep commitment to make amends and to change patterns of behavior. Such changes, she says, are not losses, but gains, opportunities to live out of our love and respect for others. I find this very hopeful. And she and I apply her ethical theology, or I don't know, some of these ideas can be applied to multicultural education. And multicultural education can be a way to maintain connection as a nation and to strengthen our democracy, which we so desperately need right now. It can move beyond the dualistic game of denouncing oppressive structures and the people who implement and benefit from them. And she also says that it can actually be counterproductive to call on people in power to give it up and over to the marginalized, because this focuses on guilt. So again, she's really wants us to focus on accountability. And through multicultural education, we can ask questions like this: who are we as Americans? Whose story matters? Whose achievements and failures shape our sense of who we are and who we can be? At the core of multicultural education is a wager, she says. A vital national identity can be constituted through multiplicity, ambiguity, and contradiction. Multicultural education shows us the reasons for a non-dualistic understanding of community. It can educate us about history and culture in a way that lays bare the checkered past of America, the mixture of opportunity and exclusion, of freedom and institutionalized racism and sexism. Multicultural education can also provide analytical and emotional tools for living within a non-dualistic understanding of ourselves, group, and national identity. A healthy identity includes seeing our failures and successes, acts of cruelty and compassion. So she has real nuance to her approach. She says that rather than being asked to feel guilty and to give up power, privileged people and oppressors are challenged to use their privilege and thereby put it at risk in the interest of justice. She says this brings about a threefold evolution. Those in power identify factors within their culture that lead to injustice. 2, they are connected with people hurt by the injustice, see their dignity and strength, and come to respect and learn from them. And 3, they learn of people who were oppressors, but who came to use their power as allies for social justice. Our ground for hope, she says, is not merely in the cries of the oppressed, but also the ability of the dominant to see injustice and work with the oppressed to create alternatives to unjust social structures. The goal for all people within multicultural education, for oppressor and oppressed, is empowerment and accountability. Just as the oppressed are empowered to resist injustice and create just structures, so oppressors are challenged to use their power for justice. I believe that implementing this kind of perspective in our multicultural education efforts hold great promise for actual positive life-giving rather than life-denying change for both the oppressor and the oppressed. When I was a minister at Minnesota Valley in Bloomington, I saw how some of our justice education focused too much on shame and accountability, and it actually turned people off and away from diving into this work. So I think Welsh's approach can really help us focus on accountability and not shame. And so finally, I like this quote. Again, her focus is where there is liberation, that is divine. She says, we participate in divinity as we delight in the beauty of humankind and as we rage against all that destroys the dignity and complexity of life. The love that gives rise to hope and to work for justice is holy. Resilient connections with other people and the earth bring joy, pain, and wisdom. These resilient connections are the presence of grace, which can move us from resignation, bitterness, and despair to passionate love and determined action. The terms holy and divine denote a quality of being within the web of life, a process of healing relationships, and they denote the quality of being worthy of honor, love, respect, and affirmation. I think this can be life-giving and joyful work. Dismantling white supremacy is liberating and joyful for both white people and people of color. And that's what I have for Sharon Welsh. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just invite thoughts on Sharon Welsh, her focus on accountability and not shame. And if you want to ask me any questions about Sharon Welsh or Anthony Pinn or any of the theologians in the previous 2 sessions. I would love to know what keeps you all in the work of racial justice. Peter, yeah, they're just like reverberation. Can't really hear you. Ooh. I don't know what's wrong. It just doesn't seem to be working. How about Ollie, Sherry, or Mike? I'm wondering, when you go to classes at Unity or other reading, what keeps you in the work? What helps you resist shame and guilt when you learn about your participation, our participation in these systems?
Well, for me, it's a continual discovery. I feel like there's a whole blind side of me that's probably really biased. And I find by attending these workshops and the like, it helps open my eyes a little and make me more aware. And so I think that's the main reason I do it. I do a fair amount of volunteer work. In fact, one of the reasons I'm late tonight is I had to pick up a guy that was released from prison today from Liberia and transport him to a shelter. And I'm thinking, I mean, a lot of the work I work when I'm transporting people, they're always of different nationalities. And at the food shelf where I work, 80% of the people are of different nationalities, and partly what I'm doing is finding different ways to engage with them in a way that is not shaming when they're asking for food, and it's affirming them. And it's a humbling experience. I just had a lady last week who we spoke through a Google Translate. I had broken Spanish. She just came from Guatemala 3 weeks ago and was wondering what kind of help we could offer her. And so I'm kind of feel like I'm immersed. The people around me, the building I live in is probably half Somali, and so I find it's all around me, and I'm sure I'm biased in certain ways. I'll give you one example. The other day, a lady came to me at the food shelf. I do an intake. There's a cubicle. They come in, we register them, all that kind of thing. And this lady walked in, and she was white, and she was about late 60s. And she said, "I'll bet you're glad to see me because I'm white." And on the one hand, I was shocked. On the other hand, I was relieved because I could clearly understand her. She had her card. She had her appointment. Everything was easy. Where it is a lot of times with people of other cultures, they didn't bring their card. They don't remember their phone number. They don't remember their address. They weren't sure if the appointment was today or yesterday. And so I was biased. I realized when I didn't say yes, but part of me said, "Oh, yes, I'm glad." But that's bias. That's
Totally.
clearly bias. And what I find is coming to these workshops keeps me being aware of that subtle bias. Afterwards, I had to say, "Yeah, that's bias. You know." So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It's that noticing without attaching shame to it. You just notice that was happening, and
Yeah.
you were able to reflect on it, and yeah.
I don't know how much time you want to take, and give you another example. I picked up a young man. He was from Somalia. He was 23 years old. He had been in prison for 5 years. I picked him up at the Whipple building, and my goal was to be with him for 4 hours until his family picked him up. So I said, "Where do you want to eat?" He said, "I want to eat at a Thai restaurant." I said, "I know a good one." So we went to eat, and then we went to a Perkins to wait for the extra 2 hours for his family to come. And we ate at a Perkins, and the waitress that served us had tattoos all up one arm and all the way up the other arm. I'm biased against tattoos. A discreet one here or there is fine. And he says to her, "Ma'am, I really like your tats." And she said, "Oh, thank you." this is kind of the history of my daughter. And she talked about her daughter and her mental illness and some of her hospitalizations. They were represented on this arm. And she said, the other arm is my brother. He had a lot of medical problems. He had diabetes and this kind of thing, and he died last year. And I was struck by, well, first of all, I'd gotten to know this young man, and he grew up in Somalia till he was 11. The back of his house was like Swiss cheese from all the bullet wound from the shots, and then came to this country. I mean, terrific, a lot of post-traumatic stress and all that kind of thing. So I'm sitting in this restaurant, and I like to think of myself as sensitive and mindful in that. And here's this dude who's been in prison for 5 years, and he connected with that waitress on a real, compassionate, human level, much better than I did. And I was really inspired by that connection that he made that I was oblivious to. So
I think that's what Sharon Welsh is talking about too. Like doing this work is liberating for all of us, and it's joyful, and we can get a larger sense of ourselves, and we can be touched by other people's experiences and let them move us to continue to work for justice, which it sounds like is what's been happening with you in your work.
Yeah.
You're not cutting yourself off. You're not shrinking. You're noticing where you're growing, and you're keeping in the work. And that's awesome.
Yeah. So it's discovery and curiosity. Discovery and curiosity, I think, are the two things that are a big part of this, rather than shame necessarily. Discovery,
Totally.
curiosity, and awareness.
You should teach some classes. I think you would be great. Discovery and curiosity. That's totally it. Well, we didn't have quite as many folks join us tonight, so it kind of went a little bit faster, but are there any other thoughts people want to share, or any other questions you have for me?
No questions, Andrea, as much as just a deep appreciation for what you shared. And for me, it's just this is part of doing the work, which is to get things in front of me that I can learn from as much as I can. I have some similar experiences to what Ali mentioned, although not at the depth of the story that you shared, Ali, but in terms of doing volunteer work or whatever. But I always want to become better at being able to understand and support the work and do the work wherever I can. And it's to get good at it, you have to practice it. And it doesn't happen overnight. You have to have an expectation that things are going to go wrong at times, and the only way is to jump into it and and do the work. Ali, your examples were excellent. Thank you. But good information. And I guess actually, Andrea, the only question I have is, and you provided some information, parts of your thesis, I think, that were available to download, which I did, although I haven't had time to look at it. But it would be interesting to get a sort of a reference list, or place things to go and do some research on my own. Whether it's something that I could find at the library or at the Unity Library.
Oh yeah, the Unity Library is great.
Yeah, and it's so much good information, and I know of other people too that are looking for good reference information. Some of the volunteer work I do is at the Arboretum, and as part of what we're doing there is trying to be in tune with some of the kinds of things that we're talking about, because they want to be very open to the entire community, not just college educated white people. And so there's a need to really be aware of that, and the kinds of things we're doing, very different from some other things like working at the food shelf or doing Meals on Wheels or whatever, which we're doing, both of those things. So
I think
that would be
there are a lot. The Unity Library has a lot of great, like, specifically anti-racism resources if you're looking for things like white fragility or unpacking reading like caste and things like that.
Right.
And then my dissertation kind of looks at more of the theological foundation. So those are, very different types of resources,
Mhm.
but both are good and helpful.
Thank you.
Can I share just one other example? I don't know
Sure.
if this relates or not, but it's kind of fun. And this happened about 2 weeks ago. And I was picking up a young man that was being released. He was being released to his family in Ohio. And I was to pick him up, take him to the bus station. And sometimes we take people out shopping because they don't have any clothes. So we went out to Walmart and we're picking clothes. And he was about 22. And I think he came, at some point, he spoke Arabic. And, but he was clearly Muslim. And we're in the store and he needed some shirts and pants. And I've got the cart and I'm pushing the cart. And he says, no, you're the senior. I should be pushing the cart for you. And I was so struck by that. I mean, here's this 22-year-old, I don't know, I think he was in for 5 months or 4 months, I think he was in jail. And I don't know, I never know the crime. We're just this humanitarian kind of thing. And I was so touched by the fact that he was saying, no, I pushed the cart. It was that reverence for elderly people. And, I was just really touched and inspired by it. And
That's awesome.
and then later he said, if you were my father, I would work very hard to help to take care of you.
Oh,
And
wow.
and again, so yeah, I was touched by it. And so to me, what I'm finding is that engagement with people of other races in different situations has been a real teaching experience for me.
You're getting your multicultural education by doing the work. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're seeing the benefits.
Oh my
Again,
God.
I just think of Sharon Welsh, and that is liberating for us as well as the people we're helping. There's joy in that work.
And I think we talked for a while, and this is sort of so he said, and he was young. He looked like he was 20, 21. He said, when I first got in prison, he said, and I'm kind of ashamed of this, he said, I really miss my family. So he said at night, I would cry at night before I go to bed.
Oh.
He said, I really missed them. But he said, I was in prison for 4 months and I got to have really good friends. And he said, today I was crying when I left prison because I had to let go of my friends.
Oh, wow. Jeez.
And what I felt good about is that in our short conversation, he felt safe enough to be able to share those kind of experiences.
Wow.
And
That's amazing.
it's rich.
Yeah.
What can I say? What can I say? It's rich.
You are doing some great work. Keep
Well,
up that good work.
Just being open to it.
Yeah. And do you find Unity a place that supports you in your work and gives you a chance for spiritual practices and sustenance? And
I keep telling people I find Unity to be as kind of an oasis in the world in which we live, to go and get nurtured. And I find it gets nurtured by the classes and the services and
good.
the gestalt, as it were, of the place. Yeah. Yes.
Well, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that. Unity is a wonderful church.
It is. It really is. Yeah.
Really enjoyed my time there when I was an intern and miss it too. Well, this has been great. I think we can.
Second,
Yes, go ahead, Pat.
I wanted to go back to the question you asked earlier about where you find joy.
Yeah.
And I find joy in having the privilege of witnessing you do this work.
Mm.
And I hope that you take that joy of doing the work yourself, because what you're doing here really matters. And just to see you take your dissertation and bring it into the world gives me tremendous joy. And I just hope that you also take joy from it.
Oh, I do. Before last week, Sunday, I was up in Appleton, Wisconsin, and did like a 2-hour version of this workshop. And it was really wonderful. People up there are super engaged in all kinds of justice efforts as well. And it was very inspiring to hear the work they're doing in a very red state with a a legislature that's completely Republican, only a Democratic governor, and they're really pushing that rock up the hill. There's people there working for pro-choice and reproductive justice. There's people working down at the legislature, their immigration, all kinds of great stuff, just like you're doing. So it is inspiring to witness their journeys too. I think we all need encouragement. And so, yeah, it's fun just to do this work. Yeah, help people make connections and keep feeling inspired to keep doing the work, because it's work for the long haul for the whole rest of our lives. Well, again, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, if you, I think most people have my email address. Feel free to send me an email if you have any other questions. All right.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks,
welcome.
Andrea. This is very helpful. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Great
See
job.
y'all. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Andrea.
You're welcome.